No one wants you." She said it to her own reflection in the dark kitchen window, and then she threw the wine glass straight at it. Caleb heard the shatter from across the street. He was on her porch before he'd decided to move, pushing the door open, finding her on the floor with glass around her knees. She looked up, humiliated, her voice breaking. "Get out!" He knelt down beside her instead. "I'm not going anywhere," he said. What Caleb didn't know that night was that this shaking, furious woman would become the reason he'd risk everything he'd spent 10 years protecting. Watch all the way to the end and tell me in the comments what city you're watching from, so I can see how far this story travels. If you're new here, follow and subscribe to the channel. Caleb Morgan opened his shop at 6 every morning, and by 6:02, he already had sawdust on his hands. That was the whole shape of his life. Wood coffee his boy, and quiet. He liked quiet the way other men liked money. He'd worked hard for it. His son Danny was 7, and Danny was the reason Caleb measured every board twice, and every risk about 100 times. 10 years of doing everything right had built him a small, sturdy world, and he had no intention of letting anyone knock it over. Then the moving truck showed up across the street. He noticed her before he knew it was her. A woman standing on the sidewalk in front of the old Hale house, holding a cardboard box against her chest like it was the only thing keeping her upright. She wasn't crying. That was the thing that stuck in him. She had the still blank face of a person who had already used up all their crying somewhere else in a room nobody was invited into. "You need a hand with those," Caleb called out, wiping his palms on his jeans. She turned. And it took him a second because the last time he'd seen this face it had been laughing 20 years younger, running down this same street barefoot in the summer. "Lena," he said. "Lena Brooks." "It's Hale again," she said. "Went back to my maiden name." A pause. "You're one of the Morgan boys." "Caleb, the middle one." "I remember." She shifted the box. "You don't need to help. I've got it." "I know you've got it. I'm asking if you'd like to not have it for 10 minutes. Something flickered across her face. Surprise maybe that anybody had offered her anything without a catch attached. Then it closed back up. "Suit yourself," she said, which wasn't yes but wasn't no. He carried boxes for an hour. She directed him in short sentences. "Kitchen, back bedroom. Leave that one. It's fragile." He didn't ask questions, and she noticed that he didn't ask questions, and he could tell she noticed. When they were done, she stood in her mother's old living room, surrounded by the wreckage of a whole life, packed into brown cardboard, and she looked lost in it. "Your mother," Caleb said carefully. She passed, 18 months ago." Lena's jaw tightened. "House was just sitting here. So you came home." "I didn't come home," she said sharply. "I ran out of anywhere else to go. There's a difference." He nodded slowly. He didn't argue with her. He'd learned in his own hard years that when a person corrects you like that, it's not really about you. It's about a wound they're still guarding. "Well," he said, backing toward the door. "You know where I am. Shop's the one with the sign. If you need anything fixed, I'm cheaper than anybody in town." "I'm not going to need anything fixed." "Sure," Caleb said. "But if you do." She needed something fixed by Thursday. He heard it before he saw it. The shriek of a faucet handle turned way too hard, and then a bang, and then a word he wouldn't have said in front of Danny. When he came out onto his own porch with his coffee, Lena was standing in her doorway, soaking wet down the front of her shirt, staring at her own hand like it had betrayed her. "Water heater," Caleb called. "The faucet came off in my hand," she said. "The hole it just came off." "Old house. Give me 2 minutes." "I didn't ask you to. You didn't have to. I've got a wrench and nowhere to be." He crossed the street. She stepped back to let him in, arms crossed, watching him like a woman who'd learned to watch men closely and expect the worst. He noticed how loose her clothes were, too big for her hanging off her shoulders, the kind of clothes a person wears when they're trying to disappear inside them. He didn't say anything about it. He fixed the faucet. "There." he said, straightening up. It was just corroded. You want I can look at the shutoff valve too, it's about 100 years old. How much? How much for what? For all of it, the faucet, the valve, whatever you're going to charge me. Caleb wiped his hands on a rag. Lena, it was a faucet. It took 4 minutes. People don't do things for free. He looked at her, then really looked, and he saw it, the flat certainty in her eyes, the way she said it like a law of physics. People don't do things for free. Somebody had taught her that. Somebody had spent years teaching her that, one disappointment at a time. Some people do, he said. You want a receipt saying you owe me nothing, I'll write one. She almost smiled. Almost. It got about halfway to her mouth, and then she caught it and put it away like a woman who no longer trusted her own good moods. You've got a kid, she said, changing the subject, nodding at the little bike lying in his yard across the street. Danny. He's 7. His mother? Not in the picture. Hasn't been for a long time. Caleb said it plainly without weight. It's just us. Lena took that in. That's hard, she said. Doing it alone. It's easier than doing it with the wrong person, he said. And he watched something move behind her eyes when he said it, a recognition like he'd accidentally described her whole marriage in one sentence. Yeah, she said quietly. Yeah, it is. It became a routine before either of them called it one. He'd bring her a coffee in the morning, set it on her porch rail, knock once, and walk back to the shop without waiting. She never came out while he was there, but the cup was always gone by noon, and once he found a coffee waiting on his own workbench, wordless from her. He fixed her porch step. He fixed the screen door. He fixed the light in the back bedroom she never turned on. And every time he came over, he learned a little more, not from what she said, but from what she did. She flinched at her phone. He saw it happen twice. It would buzz, she'd glance at it, and her whole body would change, shoulders up, jaw locked, that dead-still face again. She'd turn it face down and pretend it hadn't happened. You don't have to answer that, he said one afternoon, not looking up from the hinge he was oiling. Answer what? Whoever keeps calling. You don't owe them a pickup. Lena went very quiet. It's my ex-husband, she said finally. Okay. He wants to talk. He always wants to talk. Talking is his favorite thing because when he talks, somehow I end up being the one who's wrong. Caleb kept oiling the hinge. He'd figured out by now that she talked more when he didn't look at her. When she wasn't being watched, she could let a little truth out. How long were you married? He asked. 11 years. And now I'm a divorced woman in her dead mother's house who can't fix her own faucet, she said with a bitterness so sharp it made him look up. That's the whole story, Caleb, that's it. Don't make it interesting. I wasn't going to. Everybody wants to make it interesting. My cousin, the women at the church my mother went to. They look at me like I'm like there's a tragedy in the room. Poor Lena. Poor Lena, the divorce, and then the... She stopped hard, bit down on the word. The what? Caleb said gently. Nothing. Lena. It's nothing. I'm tired. You should go. Danny's going to be off the bus. He went. But he stood in his own kitchen that night thinking about the word she'd swallowed, and he had a feeling it was the whole heart of the thing. The word came out on a Friday, and it wasn't planned, and it came out sideways the way the real ones always do. He'd stopped by to drop off a shelf he'd made her small. Nothing. Just some scrap oak he'd had lying around, a little floating shelf for the books he'd noticed stacked on her floor. He wasn't even going to make a thing of it. He just wanted her to have a place to put her books. She stared at it in his hands like he'd handed her a live coal. You made that, she said. It's scrap wood. Took me 20 minutes. You made that. For me. Lena, it's a board with 2 brackets. Don't. Her voice cracked right down the middle. Don't do that. Don't make it small. You don't get to make it small when you... She pressed the back of her hand against her mouth. Her eyes were shining and furious. You keep doing this. You keep doing things. And I keep waiting for the part where you want something back. Because that's how it works. That's how it always works. And it hasn't come. And I don't know how to stand here not knowing when it's coming. Nothing's coming. Caleb said quietly. Everybody wants something. I want you to have somewhere to put your books." She turned away from him. Her shoulders were shaking. When she spoke again, her voice was small and wrecked, and she still wasn't looking at him. "They took part of me out," she said. "Last year, before the divorce was even final. I found a lump, and by the time it was done, they'd taken—" Her hand hovered near her chest and then dropped. "And you'd think a man would stay for that. You'd think of all the times that would be the time he'd stay. But he looked at me in that hospital bed and I watched him decide. I watched him do the math and decide I wasn't worth it anymore." Caleb didn't move. He'd learned that too. That sometimes the kindest thing you could do was hold completely still and let a person finish bleeding out the words. "He didn't even leave right away," she said, laughing, but it wasn't a laugh. "That would have been almost decent. No. He stayed and got quieter and quieter until living in that house was like living with a ghost who resented me. He stopped touching me. He stopped looking at me. And after a while, I stopped looking at me too. You know, I haven't looked in a full-length mirror in 14 months. I've got sheets over the 2 big ones in there. I put sheets over my own mirrors like I died." "You didn't die," Caleb said. "Didn't I?" She turned around. Her face was wet and stripped bare of every guard she'd been carrying. "The woman you knew running down this street. She's gone. You keep being nice to her. But she's not the one standing here. This one—" She gestured down at herself at the 2 big clothes, the thin frame. "The whole armored body, nobody wants this one. And I need you to understand that before you keep leaving coffee on my porch like I'm somebody worth the trouble, because I'm not. He proved I'm not. He had 11 years of proof, and he cashed it in." The room went dead silent. Caleb set the shelf down on the counter very carefully, and he did the thing he almost never did, the thing that cost him because Caleb Morgan had spent 10 years keeping his cards face down for the sake of one small boy across the street. He looked at her straight on. "Your husband," he said, "was a coward." "Don't. I'm not finished. Your husband was a coward, and cowards can't see. That's the whole thing about them. They can't see what's in front of them because they're too busy running from it. So don't hand me his eyesight and tell me it's the truth. He didn't stop wanting you because you weren't worth wanting. He stopped because he wasn't man enough to stay in the room when it got hard. Those are 2 completely different sentences, Lena, and you've been living inside the wrong one for over a year." She was crying openly now and shaking her head, but she wasn't telling him to leave. "You don't know that," she whispered. "I know cowards. I married one in a way. I know what it looks like when somebody decides a person's too much trouble and walks. And I promise you the trouble is never with the person they left." He took a breath. "You keep saying nobody wants you like it's a fact you looked up somewhere. It's not a fact, it's a wound. And you've been picking at it so long you can't tell the difference anymore." "Stop being kind to me," she said, wrecked. "I can't. I don't have anywhere to put it. When you're kind to me, I don't know where to put it. And it hurts, Caleb. It actually hurts." "Then it hurts," he said. "I'm not going to be cruel to you to make it easier." She sat down hard on the arm of the couch like her legs had quit. For a long time, neither of them said anything. Outside, faintly, the school bus groaned to a stop at the corner, and Caleb knew he had about 90 seconds before a 7-year-old came looking for him. "I have to get Danny," he said. "I know." "Lena." He waited until she looked up. "I'm going to keep bringing the coffee." "Why?" "Because you drink it." He picked up his tools. "That's the only reason I need." And he left her sitting there in her dead mother's living room, with a floating shelf on the counter, and something cracked open in her chest that she'd spent 14 months keeping sealed. She heard him call to his boy across the street. She heard the small bright sound of the kid's voice answering back. "Dad." "Dad, guess what happened at recess?" And she heard Caleb say, "Tell me everything, buddy." Like the answer mattered more than anything in the world. And Lena Hale, who had put sheets over her mirrors, sat very still and listened to a man love his son from all the way across the street. And for the first time in over a year, she thought, I want to be near that. Whatever that is. I want to be near it. She didn't trust the thought. She'd learned not to trust anything that felt like hope, because hope was just disappointment that hadn't arrived yet. But she couldn't make the thought go away either. The nights were the worst, and that Friday night was the worst of the worst. Because he'd cracked something open, and now everything she'd been holding down came up at once. She poured a glass of wine she shouldn't have. Then another. And the phone buzzed on the counter, him again, the little name lighting up the dark like it always did. Marcus, 11 years of her life reduced to 7 letters and a green button she never pressed. She let it ring out. Then it rang again. Then a text. Lena, we need to talk about the paperwork. Stop being childish. Childish. That word. That was his favorite blade, the one he'd sharpened for 11 years, turning her every real feeling into childishness, her every objection into hysteria, until she'd stopped trusting the inside of her own head. She stood up too fast. The room tilted. She caught her reflection in the dark kitchen window, thin, hollow-eyed, a sheet-covered mirror in human form, and something in her just came apart. No one wants you, she told the woman in the glass, told her flat like a fact. No one wants you. And then she threw the wine glass at her own reflection as hard as she could. The crash was enormous in the quiet street. She didn't hear the front door. She was on the floor by then, down among the glass. Both hands over her face, making a sound she didn't recognize as her own. She only knew he was there when she felt him. Not grabbing her. Not pulling her up. Just there, kneeling down into the broken glass beside her, like it was nothing. Like the mess didn't matter, like she was the only thing in the room worth being careful about. Get out, she whispered into her hands. Please, not like this. Don't see me like this. I'm not going anywhere, Caleb said. You should. You should run. Everybody runs, so just do it now. Do it fast. Get it over with. Lena. His voice was low and steady, and it cut clean through the noise in her head. Look at me. I can't. You can. I'm not asking you to be okay. I'm asking you to look at me. She dropped her hands. And there he was, kneeling in her broken glass at 11 o'clock at night, with sawdust still under his nails, and his son asleep in the house across the street. And he wasn't looking at her the way Marcus had looked at her in that hospital bed. He wasn't doing the math. There was no math in his face at all. You heard the glass, she said, dazed. I heard the glass. And you just came. Where else would I go? He said, like it was the most obvious thing in the world. And that not the shelf, not the coffee, not the kind words, that was the thing that undid her. Because kind words she could argue with. Kind words she could call charity and throw back. But a man who crossed a dark street at 11 at night without stopping to think, and knelt down in the glass and asked nothing, and offered nothing, but where else would I go? She had no defense built for that. In 11 years of marriage, no one had ever once come running toward her breaking. They only ever ran the other way. I broke my mirror, she said, and started to laugh, and the laugh turned into something worse, and Caleb reached out and just held her shoulder, one hand steady, an anchor, and nothing more. Then we'll get you a new mirror, he said, a better one, and you're going to look in it. I'm not. You are. Not tonight, not tomorrow. But someday you're going to look in a mirror in this house, and you're not going to see what he told you was there. His hand tightened once on her shoulder. You're going to see what I see. Lena looked at him through the wreck of her own face, this quiet man she'd known when they were both children, this stranger who'd rebuilt half her house one 4-minute favor at a time. And what do you see? She whispered. Caleb Morgan opened his mouth to answer her. And then he stopped himself, not because he didn't have the answer, but because he understood in that moment, kneeling in her broken glass, that some answers are too big to spend on a floor at 11 at night. Some answers you have to earn the right to say. So instead, he stood and he pulled her carefully up out of the glass with him, and he set her down on the couch and he found a broom, and while she sat shaking with her arms wrapped around herself, he swept up every shard of the mirror she'd thrown at her own reflection, slow and patient, like a man who had all the time in the world and no intention of leaving before the job was done. The broom found the last shard under the radiator, and Caleb bent to pick it up with his fingers so it wouldn't cut her later. Lena watched him do it. She watched a grown man on his knees at midnight combing a stranger's floor for broken glass, and she couldn't make it fit anywhere in her head. "You'll cut yourself," she said. "I've had worse than a mirror," he said. "Why are you doing this?" "Because if I leave a piece and you step on it Tuesday, I'll feel it all the way across the street." He dropped the last sliver into the dustpan. "Stay put. I'm not done." She stayed put. That in itself was strange. A month ago, she wouldn't have let a man tell her to stay anywhere. She'd spent the last year of her marriage learning to brace against every soft instruction because Marcus's kindness always had a hook in it, and the hook always came later, and it always went in deep. But there was no hook in this. She kept waiting to feel it, and it kept not coming, and the waiting was its own kind of exhaustion. Caleb dumped the glass in the trash and washed his hands at the sink she'd once tried to charge him for fixing. Then he came back and crouched in front of her, not too close, his forearms on his knees. "You had wine," he said. It wasn't a judgment. It was just a fact he was setting down between them. "A little." "Lena." "Okay. A lot. 2 glasses. 3. She pressed the heel of her hand into her eye. "It's not a habit. I want you to know that. It's not a thing I do. Tonight was just. You don't have to explain it to me. I want to explain it to you." Her voice came out sharper than she meant, and she flinched at her own sharpness, because that was another thing Marcus had trained into her, the flinch after every raised word, the little duck of the head like the ceiling might come down. "Sorry. Don't do that." "Do what?" "That. The sorry after nothing." Caleb studied her. "You apologized for having a feeling out loud. Who taught you to do that?" She didn't answer. She didn't have to. He already knew the answer, and she could see that he knew, and somehow his knowing, without her saying it, was worse and better at the same time. "It's late," she said. "You've got Danny." "Danny's asleep. Danny sleeps like the dead. Comes from a clean conscience." Caleb almost smiled. "I've got a few minutes." So he stayed a few minutes. He didn't sit next to her. He pulled the kitchen chair around and sat facing her close enough that she could see the sawdust still caught in the creases of his knuckles, far enough that she never once felt cornered. And she noticed that too, the exact distance of him, how careful it was. And she wondered how a man learned to sit at exactly the distance a frightened woman could stand. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "You can ask. The mother, Danny's mother. You said she's not in the picture, but you didn't say it mean. Most people say it mean." Caleb was quiet for a moment. She'd stumbled onto his sealed room the same way he'd stumbled onto hers, and for a second she thought he wouldn't answer, and she braced to have that thrown back at her mind. "Your business. We're not doing this." But he answered. "Her name was Claire," he said. "We were young and stupid, and then Danny came, and it turned out she wanted the young and stupid part, not the Danny part. She stuck it out about a year. Then one morning she said she felt like she was drowning, and she left before lunch." He turned his hands over, looked at his own palms. "I was angry about it for a long time. Years. Then I figured out the anger was just fear wearing a costume. I was scared I couldn't do it alone. Turned out I could. Turned out the 2 of us alone was steadier than the 3 of us pretending." "Do you hate her?" "No. She did the honest thing in the end. She left instead of staying and rotting the house from the inside." He looked up at Lena, and there was no accusation in it, but there was a truth, and the truth landed square. "That's the difference, see? Some people leave clean, and some people stay, and make you wish they'd left. Your husband did the second one, mine did the first. And I'll tell you the first one heals. The second one, the staying and the poisoning, that's the one that puts sheets over the mirrors." Lena's throat closed. She looked away toward the window. The dark window, the one without a reflection anymore. "I really did that," she said. "I really covered the mirrors. That's a crazy person thing to do. It's a grieving person thing to do. Same difference some days." "No," Caleb said. "It isn't. And you know it isn't, or you wouldn't have let me sweep the floor." He stood up then and set the chair back where it belonged, exactly where it belonged, and she understood that he was a man who put things back. "I'm going to head home, but I want you to do one thing for me before you sleep." "What?" "Drink some water, whole glass, and lock the door behind me." He paused at the door. "Not because anybody's coming, just because it's yours to lock now. That's the whole thing about a door. It's yours." He left, and she got up on legs that still shook a little, and she drank a whole glass of water standing at the sink, and then she went and turned the deadbolt, and she stood there with her hand on it for a long moment, feeling the weight of a lock that was hers. Then she went to bed, and for the first night in 14 months, she didn't lie awake rehearsing all the ways she had failed to be worth keeping. She slept. The next morning there was a coffee on her porch rail. Same as always. But this time, tucked under the cup so the wind wouldn't take it, there was a scrap of shop paper with 3 words on it in blocky carpenter's print. Not a love note, nothing like it. It just said, "Look today, try." She knew what he meant. She stood on the porch in her robe with the warm cup in her hands, and she looked across the street at his shop. The lights already on at 6 in the morning, and she felt the thing she was most afraid of feeling. She felt hope. It came up through her chest, like water through a crack. And she hated it, because hope was the thing that had the farthest to fall. She went inside. She stood in the hallway in front of the biggest mirror, the one with the sheet over it, and she put her hand on the fabric. Her heart was slamming. It was insane, she told herself. It was completely insane to be terrified of a piece of glass. But she was. She was terrified of it. Because the last time she'd really looked, she'd been in a hospital gown, and a man she'd promised her life to had been standing behind her doing the math. "Just try," she said out loud in the empty house. She pulled the sheet halfway down. She saw the top of her own head, her hair. She'd cut it short in the hospital and never grown it back, and it was going gray at the temples now, and she stared at the gray for a second, and then her nerve broke and she yanked the sheet back up and walked out of the hall shaking. But she'd seen the top of her head. It was more than she'd seen in over a year, and she thought, that's something, that's a start. And then she was furious at herself for grading her own courage like a schoolteacher, and then she laughed at how tangled up she was. And the laugh surprised her because it was real. It was the first thing that week that felt like the old Lena. Just a flicker, just a spark under the ash. But it was there. By the second week of him bringing coffee, the whole street had noticed. She found that out from Mrs. Ferris, who lived 2 doors down, and had lived 2 doors down since before Lena was born, and who considered the comings and goings of the block to be her personal responsibility. Lena was checking her mail when Mrs. Ferris came across the grass at a speed that belied her 78 years. "That Morgan boy's been bringing you coffee," Mrs. Ferris announced. "Good morning to you too. Every morning, I've counted." Mrs. Ferris folded her arms. "He's a good one, that one. Raised that little boy up right all by himself, never a word of complaint. Not like some." She sniffed. "You could do a lot worse, honey." "It's coffee, Mrs. Ferris, not a proposal. Everything's coffee until it isn't." The old woman leaned in, and her voice went softer, and the nosiness fell off it, and underneath was something almost tender. "I knew your Mama Lena. She worried about you those last years. She used to tell me my girl married a cold man, and she's getting colder to match him. It broke her heart watching you go quiet." Lena stood very still with her mail in her hand. She said that. She said that. Right on that porch more than once. Mrs. Ferris patted her arm with one dry hand. "She'd be glad is all I'm saying. To see somebody bring you a warm thing in the morning. That's all she ever wanted for you. Somebody who'd bring you a warm thing and not ask for it back." And then the old woman shuffled off, having detonated that directly into the center of Lena's chest, entirely unaware, humming to herself. Lena went inside and sat down at her mother's kitchen table, the table she'd eaten at as a girl, and she cried for her mother for the first time since the funeral. Not the ugly whine crying from the night of the mirror. A cleaner grief. She cried because her mother had watched her go cold, and had worried and had died before she got to see her come back. And Lena hadn't even known she'd been that cold. Hadn't known it showed. Hadn't known she'd worried her own dying mother, with how small she'd let herself become. That afternoon she walked across the street to the shop. She'd never done that. He always came to her. But she walked across and she stood in the doorway of his workshop, and he looked up from a table he was sanding with something like alarm, because in all these weeks she'd never once crossed the street toward him. "Everything okay?" he said, straightening up. "I want to buy something," she said. "A real thing, that I pay real money for, not a favor, a purchase." "Okay." He wiped his hands. "What are you after?" "A mirror stand, a frame, something I can put a mirror in that I chose. Not the ones in the house. Those are hers. They're my mother's, and they've got 14 months of me not looking at them soaked into the glass." She heard her own voice steady, almost fierce. "I want a new one. Mine. And I want to pay for it because I need there to be one thing in that house that I got for myself, and not because somebody felt sorry for me." Caleb looked at her for a long moment, and then slowly he smiled, and it was the first full smile she'd seen from him, and it changed his whole face. "I can build you a mirror frame," he said. "What kind of wood?" "I don't know wood. Come here, I'll show you." And he walked her along the racks, and he pulled down samples, and he told her about oak and walnut and cherry. How cherry darkened as it aged, how it started pale and honey-colored, and grew richer and deeper. Every single year, it lived until an old cherry piece was almost red, almost alive. And she listened to him talk about wood aging into something better, something deeper, something richer for the years, and she knew he wasn't only talking about wood, and she let him not only be talking about wood, and neither of them said so. "Cherry," she said. "I want the cherry." "Cherry it is." He set the sample in her hand and closed her fingers around it, just for a second, just his rough palm over her knuckles, and then he let go before it could become anything she'd have to be afraid of. "Give me a week." That was the first purchase. It would not be the last. But it was the one that mattered, because for the first time she had walked toward him instead of waiting, and something in the machinery of the two of them shifted gears, and they both felt it move. Then the following Thursday, Marcus called 4 times before noon, and the fragile new thing nearly broke before it had a chance to grow. She didn't tell Caleb about the calls at first. She sat in her house with the phone buzzing on the counter, and she felt the old cold come back over her like a tide, and she thought, of course you got a week of feeling human, and now here's the bill." That was how her mind worked after 11 years. Every good thing was a loan, and the interest was cruelty, and the note always came due. The 5th call she answered it. She didn't know why. Maybe to get it over with. Maybe because the buzzing was going to drive her out of her skin. "What?" she said. "There she is?" Marcus's voice. Smooth, warm, terrible. The voice he used when he was about to be reasonable at her. "I was starting to think you'd blocked me." "I should have." "Lena, come on, we're adults. There's paperwork. The house here, the one we owned, it sold, and there's your half, and I can't get it to you if you won't talk to me for 30 seconds. A pause calibrated. "Unless you don't want your half." Which would be very you, actually. Cutting off your nose. And there it was. 30 seconds in. The little jab folded inside the helpful sentence so smooth, she'd have doubted she felt it if she hadn't spent 11 years feeling it. Very you. Cutting off your nose. She was already somehow the unreasonable one, and he was already somehow the patient man doing her a favor. "Send it to my lawyer," she said. "You have a lawyer now." He sounded amused. "Look at you. Somebody's built you a spine. Who is he?" "What?" "There's always a he, Lena. You don't do anything on your own. You never have. So who is he? Some guy in that little town feeling sorry for the divorced woman with the..." He didn't finish it. He let the sentence hang so that she'd finish it herself in her own head, the way he'd trained her to. The divorced woman with the missing part. The divorced woman with the scars. He let her say the cruel thing to herself so his hands stayed clean. And a month ago, it would have worked. A month ago, she'd have hung up and put a sheet over another mirror. But she'd seen the top of her own gray head in a hallway. And a man had knelt in her broken glass and asked, "Where else would I go?" And her dead mother had worried about her going cold. And somewhere in the last 4 weeks, without noticing exactly when Lena Hale had started to get warm again. "His name," she said, and her voice did not shake. is none of your business. And I'm not the woman you left in that hospital, Marcus. That woman would have apologized to you by now. I've timed it. It usually takes about 90 seconds, and then I'm the one saying sorry. Well, she looked at the clock. It's been 3 minutes, and I'm not sorry for anything. Send it to my lawyer. She hung up. Her hands were shaking so hard, she dropped the phone. But she'd done it. She'd stayed on the line for 3 minutes with the man who'd spent 11 years dismantling her, and she hadn't apologized once, and she'd hung up on him instead of the other way around. She stood in her kitchen breathing like she'd run a race, and then a laugh came out of her, disbelieving, almost a sob, and she pressed both hands over her mouth. She wanted to tell somebody. She wanted to tell him. That was new too, wanting to bring the good news across the street. But when she got to the shop, she found she couldn't say it plainly. She stood in the doorway, and Caleb looked up and read her face in half a second, the way he always did. "What happened?" he said, already setting the tool down. "I hung up on him." "On my ex, Marcus. He called about paperwork, and he started, he does this thing, he makes you the crazy one. He's so good at it, you don't even feel the knife go in. And I..." She stopped, breathed. "I stayed on the phone 3 minutes, and I didn't say sorry once, and then I hung up on him." Caleb didn't cheer. She half expected him to make a big warm fuss, and she didn't know if she could stand a fuss. Instead, he just nodded slowly, like a man acknowledging a serious accomplishment by a serious person. 3 minutes, he said. 3 minutes. How long did it used to take? Before you'd cave? Her eyes filled. That he knew to ask that. That he knew there was a clock at all. "About 90 seconds, she whispered. "So you doubled it." Caleb picked his tool back up, and there was the ghost of a smile on him. "Next time you'll do 5. Then you won't answer at all. That's how it goes. You don't quit a thing like that all at once. You do it in minutes. You already know that, though. You just built me a spine," he said. "Well, you built your own. I didn't do a thing. You did everything," she said, and her voice cracked, and she was horrified to hear it crack. But he didn't look away from the crack, and he didn't flinch from it. He just held her eyes across his own workshop with sawdust in the air between them, and neither of them said anything else, because there wasn't anything else that needed saying right then. That was a Thursday. By Saturday, Danny had entered the story, and everything got both sweeter and more dangerous at once. It happened because the boy got curious. 7-year-olds notice when their father starts crossing the street every morning, and Danny had been noticing for weeks, and finally on Saturday morning, he simply followed his dad across in his pajamas, dragging a stuffed rabbit by one ear, and appeared on Lena's porch behind Caleb like a small, solemn ghost. "Danny," Caleb said, turning. "Buddy, you can't just..." "Is this the coffee lady?" Danny said. Lena had opened the door in her robe. She looked down at the small boy with the serious eyes and the ratty rabbit, and something happened in her chest that she was not prepared for at all. It was not a small thing. It was a very large thing, and it arrived without warning, and it nearly took her legs out from under her, because there had been once before the cancer, before all of it, a plan for a child. There had been a plan, and then there had been no plan because Marcus had decided, and then there'd been the surgery, and then there'd been no possibility of a plan ever again. And she had folded that grief up so small and put it away so deep that she'd almost convinced herself it wasn't there. And now there was a 7-year-old on her porch with a rabbit. "Yeah," she said, and her voice came out rough. "Yeah, I'm the coffee lady." "Dad makes you coffee," Danny said in the tone of a prosecutor. "He doesn't even make me coffee." "Coffee's bad for kids," Lena said. "Stunts your growth. You want to be tall, right?" "How tall?" "Taller than your dad." Danny considered this. It was clearly a serious ambition. "Okay," he said, and then, having settled the coffee question, he wandered past both adults straight into her house like he owned it, dragging the rabbit, and started examining the stack of books still sitting on her floor because she hadn't put up the shelf. He'd never know Caleb made her. "Danny," Caleb said, mortified, "but you don't just walk into people's." "It's fine," Lena said, and she was surprised to find it was fine. It was more than fine. "Let him look." Danny found a picture book among her grown-up books, a battered old thing that had been her own as a child and had somehow survived every move, and he held it up. "Can you read this?" "Danny, Caleb," Lena said quietly. "It's okay." And she sat down on her own living room floor in her robe next to a strange man's 7-year-old. And she read him a picture book she'd loved when she was small, and Caleb stood in the doorway watching the two of them, and did not say a single word because there was nothing to say, because the thing happening on that floor was bigger than words, and he had the sense not to break it. When she finished the book, Danny said, "Again," the way children do, and she read it again, and Caleb finally had to physically extract his son with promises of pancakes, and the two of them went back across the street, and Lena sat on her floor for a long time afterward, holding the picture book and pressing it to her chest, and not crying deliberately, not crying, breathing very carefully around the enormous tender wound the boy had reopened without knowing it was there. That evening, Caleb came back over alone after Danny was down, and he stood on her porch, and he looked at her with something careful in his face. "I have to tell you something," he said, "and I need you to hear all of it before you get scared." "That's a scary way to start." "I know. Sorry. Let me just—" He put his hands in his pockets. "Danny doesn't take to people. I want you to understand that. He's a friendly kid, but he doesn't take to people, not really, not since Claire. He keeps a wall up, my boy. Smart of him. But he took to you in about 4 minutes flat on your floor with a book, and I've never seen him do that. Ever. With anybody." Lena's heart was going hard. "Caleb, I'm not asking you for anything," he said quickly, holding up a hand. "That's the whole point of what I'm telling you. I'm not asking. I want to be honest with you, because you've had a lifetime of men who weren't. So here's me being honest. My kid likes you. I like you. And that's a lot of weight to hang on a woman who's still learning to look in a mirror, and I know it, and I don't want to hang it on you. But I'm not going to hide it from you either, because hiding it would be the coward's move. And I'll be a lot of things, but I won't be that." She stood in her doorway and looked at this man who had just handed her his son's heart and his own in the same breath, plainly no hook, no interest owed, and told her she was free to hand them both back. "I'm not ready," she said, and her voice broke on it. "Caleb, I want to be. I think somewhere in me I want to be, but I'm not, I can't. I don't have the— I broke a mirror 3 weeks ago. I'm not a woman you should be handing a little boy to. I could break so easily, and then he'd have another one who left." "I know." "You don't know. He's 7. He's 7, and he took 4 minutes, and if I break, he's going to." "Lena!" Caleb said her name low, and it stopped her. "I'm not handing you my son. I'm telling you the weather, that's all. I'm telling you what's true, so you're never blindsided. You don't have to do anything with it. You can put it in a drawer. I just needed there to be one man in your life who told you the truth even when it scared him. That's the whole gift. There's no bill." And then he did the thing. He did the thing that undid her every time, the thing no other man in her life had ever once done. He gave her the last word, and the closed door, and the lock that was hers, and he stepped back off her porch, into the dark, and went home to his boy, asking her for nothing, leaving her holding everything. She stood in the doorway a long time after his lights went out. Then she went inside and she walked down the hall to the big mirror with the sheet. And this time her hands were still shaking, but she didn't stop. She pulled the sheet all the way down, and she made herself look. All of it. The gray at her temples, and the thinness of her, and the loose robe, and the flat truth of her body, and the face that had survived things. And she stood there, and she looked at the whole woman in the glass, the real one. The one she'd told nobody wanted. "He wants you," she said to the woman in the mirror, testing it, trying the shape of it in her mouth. "And that little boy wants you, and you're standing here looking so maybe. Maybe you want you too. A little, maybe." The woman in the mirror looked back at her terrified and alive, and did not disappear. She left the sheet off. She left it off and went to bed. And in the morning, when she woke, The mirror was still there, uncovered, and she was still there, and the world had not ended for either of them. She thought that was the hard part behind her. She thought the mirror was the mountain, and she'd climbed it. She was wrong, and she found out how wrong 3 days later, when a car she recognized pulled up in front of her house, and Marcus got out. She saw him from the window. Her whole body went cold, that old brace, that old duck of the head. He was standing on her mother's lawn in his good coat, looking up at the house with that expression. He had the reasonable one, the one that meant he was about to be very calm and very cruel, and she felt 14 months of hard-won ground start to slide out from under her all at once. He knocked. She didn't open it. "Lena?" His voice through the door, warm, patient. "I drove 3 hours. The least you can do is open the door. I'm not here to fight. I'm here because I'm worried about you. Your cousin called me. She says you're not yourself. She says there's some man, some handyman taking advantage of you while you're vulnerable, and I couldn't just sit there. So open the door. Let me see you're okay, that's all." Every word of it was a hook. Every single word. Your cousin called me, so now she was a person other people worried about behind her back. Taking advantage of you while you're vulnerable. So now the one good thing in her life was a predator, and she was too weak to see it. I'm worried about you, so now if she turned him away. She was ungrateful, cruel, cutting off her own nose. He'd built the whole trap in 4 sentences through a closed door, and she could feel every wall of it closing in, and her hand actually rose toward the deadbolt. The deadbolt Caleb had told her was hers, and she watched her own hand rise like it belonged to somebody else. Like 11 years of training were driving it, and she thought, no, it's mine. The lock is mine. She put her hand down. "Go home, Marcus," she said through the door. "Lena, open the..." "You didn't drive 3 hours because you're worried about me. You've never worried about me in your life. You drove 3 hours because somebody told you I stopped being small, and you can't stand it. You can't stand that I stopped." Her voice was shaking, but it did not stop. "There's no man taking advantage of me. There's a man who brought me coffee and didn't ask for a single thing back, and you don't understand that, do you? You literally cannot understand it because you've never done one thing in your life without a bill attached, so you can't picture it. You think it has to be a trap because for you it always was." Silence on the other side of the door. "Open the door," Marcus said, and the warmth had gone out of his voice now, and what was left was the thing that had always been under the warmth, cold and flat and mean. "Open the door, Lena, or I'll stand out here and make a scene. And won't that be something for your little town to talk about? The unstable divorcee. You know how you get. And that last one. You know how you get." He'd said it to her 1,000 times, and 1,000 times it had worked. It had made her doubt her own eyes, her own memory. Her own mind made her the crazy one, made her small. And this time, she opened the door, but not to let him in. She opened it, and she stood in the doorway full height in the daylight where the whole street could see her, and she looked at the man who'd done the math over her hospital bed, and she was not afraid of him. She noticed with a kind of wonder that she was simply not afraid. "I don't get any way," she said. "You told me how I get for 11 years until I believed you. But I've been living alone for over a year now, Marcus, and you know what I found out. I don't get any way at all. I'm not unstable. I was never unstable. You just needed me to think I was because a woman who thinks she's crazy is real easy to keep." Marcus's jaw worked. He wasn't used to this. He had no play for this because his entire game required her to be smaller than him, and she wasn't being smaller. "You're making a scene," he said. "You said you'd make one. I'm just standing in my own doorway, in my own house, that my mother left me, and you're the one on the lawn." She reached for the door. "Send the paperwork to my lawyer. And Marcus, don't come back here. This is my street now, not yours." And she closed the door. And she locked it, and the lock was hers. She heard him stand out there a while. She heard him knock again twice, and then stop. She stood with her back against the door and her hand over her hammering heart, and she waited for the collapse, the shaking, the whine, the sheet over the mirror, because that was what always came after she'd been near him. It didn't come. Instead, there was a different knock, softer from the side, and Caleb's voice low and even. "Lena, it's me. I saw the car. Are you all right? You don't have to open up, just tell me you're all right or I'm calling somebody." She opened the door. Caleb stood there with Danny's little hand in his, the boy having clearly refused to be left across the street, and behind Caleb, she could see that he'd positioned himself between her door and Marcus's car without seeming to, just casually standing exactly there. And she understood that he'd been watching the whole time, ready, not interfering, just there at exactly the right distance, the way he always was. "He's leaving," Lena said. And they both watched Marcus get into his car with his good coat and his reasonable face, now furious, now small, and drive away 3 hours back to wherever he'd built his next tidy little kingdom. "You want me to follow him a ways," Caleb said. "Make sure he's actually gone." "No!" She was almost laughing, giddy with adrenaline and something else, something enormous. "No, he's gone. I sent him away. Caleb, I sent him away. I stood in the door and I wasn't even scared. I've been scared of that man for 11 years. And I stood in the door and then she was crying. But it was the good kind, the clean kind. And Danny looked up at his father with alarm, and Caleb crouched down and murmured something to him. And the boy considered the crying woman for a moment, with his serious eyes, and then he did the thing that broke Lena open completely. He walked over and he held up the stuffed rabbit to her, offered it. The way you offer the most important thing you own to somebody who's sad. "You can hold Boots," Danny said. "He helps when you cry." Lena took the rabbit. She took the ratty stuffed rabbit from a 7-year-old boy on her porch, and she held it against her chest, and she looked over the top of the child's head at his father, and there were no words at all for what passed between the two adults in that moment, no words that would survive being said out loud, so neither of them said any. "Thank you, Danny," she managed. "Boots helps a lot." "I know," Danny said gravely. "He's the best." Later, after the boy had been walked home and fed and put to bed, Caleb came back once more. He always came back once more. And they stood on her porch in the dark, and for a while neither of them said anything. And it wasn't uncomfortable. The silence. It was the good silence, the one they'd been building between them, one repaired hinge and one dropped coffee at a time. "I've been thinking," Caleb said finally. "That sounds dangerous." "It usually is." He turned the brim of an invisible hat in his hands, a nervous habit she'd never seen on him, and she realized with a jolt that steady Caleb Morgan was nervous, and it did something to her to see it. "I've been bringing you coffee for 6 weeks. And that's fine. Coffee's fine, but I think we both know it stopped being about coffee a while back, and I don't want to be a coward about it. So I'm going to say a true thing, and you can put it in a drawer if you need to, same as before, no bill." Lena's heart climbed into her throat. "Caleb, I would like," he said carefully, "to take you to dinner. Not a favor, not a fix, not the handyman helping out the sad lady across the street. A dinner. Where I put on a shirt without sawdust on it, and I come to your door, and I take you somewhere, and I look at you across a table like a woman I'm lucky to be across a table from. Because that's what you are. And I'm tired of pretending the coffee's the whole story." The old Lena, the frightened one, the one Marcus built, opened her mouth to say no. To say, "I'm not ready," to say, "I could break," to say, "You deserve someone whole," to say all the small, careful, protective things she'd been saying for 14 months. But that woman was quieter now. She'd been getting quieter for 6 weeks. And a different voice, an older one. A voice she'd almost forgotten she had, the voice of the girl who used to run down this street barefoot in the summer. That voice got there first. "Yes," Lena said. "Pick me up Friday. And Caleb." She smiled, and it reached all the way to her eyes, and it wasn't a smile learned from surviving. It was the other kind, the kind she thought she'd lost. "Wear the shirt without the sawdust, but leave a little on. Just so I know it's still you." Friday came slower than any day Lena could remember, and faster than she was ready for both at once. She spent the afternoon standing in front of the mirror she no longer covered, holding 2 dresses against herself, putting one down, picking it up again, hating herself for caring this much anyway. She hadn't dressed for a man in years. Marcus had stopped noticing what she wore somewhere around year 6, and after the surgery he'd stopped looking at her at all, and a woman learns fast not to bother dressing for a man who's decided not to see her. But Caleb saw her. That was the terrifying thing. That was the whole terrifying thing. She settled on the blue one. It was older from before, from the version of her that ran down the street barefoot, and it hung looser on her now than it used to. But when she put it on and made herself look, she didn't see the loose parts first. For the first time in 14 months, she didn't inventory the damage before anything else. She just saw a woman in a blue dress who was going to dinner. It took her by surprise how much it undid her to look in a mirror and simply see a woman going to dinner. At 6 o'clock exactly, because he was a man who did things exactly, Caleb knocked. She opened the door, and he was standing there in a clean shirt, pressed buttoned, and she could tell he'd tried. She could tell he'd stood in front of his own mirror, the way she'd stood in front of hers. And there was a small streak of sawdust deliberately left along one forearm, and when she saw it, she laughed out loud, because he'd remembered he'd actually left the sawdust on because she'd asked him to. "You left it on," she said. "You told me to." He looked at her, then all of her the blue dress, and something moved across his face that no man had aimed at her in a very long time. And it wasn't the doing the math look, it was the opposite of that look. It was a man looking at a woman like she was the answer instead of the problem. "Lena, you look." "Don't," she said, but softly, not the old sharp way. "I'm going to. You look beautiful. I'm not going to not say it just because it makes you squirm. You can squirm, but you're going to hear it. You look beautiful." She squirmed, and she heard it, and she carried it with her all the way to the car, that word holding it carefully like something that might spill. He'd found a place 2 towns over, small quiet, the kind of place with paper on the tables, and a woman who'd been running it for 30 years and called everybody honey. And Lena understood immediately why he'd picked it. It was the kind of place where nobody knew her. Nobody knew the divorced woman with the surgery, and the dead mother, and the man who used to make scenes on lawns. She could just be a woman in a blue dress out to dinner with a man in a clean shirt. "How'd you find this place?" she said. "I built the owner a set of shelves 2 years back. She feeds me for life, apparently. I could have retired on the pie alone." He unfolded his napkin. "Figured you might like somewhere that didn't have a whole history attached, somewhere you get to be new." And there it was again. That thing he did. He'd chosen the whole evening around a wound she'd never even told him she had, the wound of being known too well of every eye in her hometown carrying a file on her. He'd seen it without being told, and he'd built the night to protect it the way he built everything, quietly, load-bearing, no announcement. "You do that a lot," she said. "Do what?" "Take care of a thing I never said out loud. How do you?" She started again. "How do you always know?" Caleb thought about it. Really thought, turning his water glass a slow quarter turn on the paper tablecloth. "I don't know that I know," he said. "I just pay attention. That's all it is, Lena. It's not a gift. It's just most people are so busy figuring out what they're going to say next that they never actually watch the person in front of them. I got real quiet after Claire left, had nobody to talk to but a baby, so I learned to watch instead of talk. Turns out you find out just about everything about a person if you shut up long enough." Marcus talked constantly, Lena said, and she wasn't sure why she said it, except that it just came the way things came out around Caleb, sideways and true. 11 years, and I don't think that man ever once shut up long enough to see me. He talked at me, about me, never to me, and never once with the lights off, just quiet, just being in a room together, being quiet. He couldn't stand quiet. I think quiet scared him. I think if it got quiet, he'd have had to actually notice I was there. "That's the loneliest thing I ever heard," Caleb said. "It was the loneliest thing I ever lived." And then the food came and broke the moment before it got too heavy, and the woman who ran the place called them both Honey and Caleb, told a story about Danny putting a frog in the church collection plate, and Lena laughed so hard she had to put her fork down, and for 2 whole hours she forgot to be afraid. It was the forgetting that scared her afterward. On the drive home, warm and full and lighter than she'd been in a year, She caught herself just being happy, and the old alarm went off deep in her. The one that said, happy is a loan and the interest is cruelty. And she felt herself start to pull back, start to armor up, and Caleb, who watched everything, felt it happen in the passenger seat beside him. "There it is," he said quietly, eyes on the road. "There what is? You went away just now. We were fine, and then you went somewhere. I felt it." He didn't sound hurt. He sounded patient, like a man who'd expected the tide to come in because tides come in. "You want to tell me where you went, or you want to just sit with it? Both are fine." She was quiet a long moment. "I got happy," she said finally. "And then I got scared of being happy. Because the last time I let myself be really happy, it was right before the worst year of my life. So my body doesn't trust it anymore. Happy feels like the top of a hill you're about to fall down." Caleb nodded slowly. "That makes sense," he said. "That's not crazy. That's just a body that learned a lesson. The trouble is, it learned the wrong lesson. It learned happy causes the fall. But happy didn't cause the fall, Lena. Marcus caused the fall. Happy was just standing next to him when he pushed." She turned and looked at him in the dark of the car, the passing streetlights washing over his face. "How are you so—" she started, and couldn't finish it. "So what?" "So okay. So steady. He took 11 years to make me like this, and you've just always been like this calm, and I keep waiting to find the crack in you, the thing that's going to come out later, the real you, under the nice one, because there's always a real one under the nice one, and I—" Caleb pulled the car over. He didn't do it dramatically. He just signaled and pulled onto the shoulder and put it in park, and turned to face her, and she felt her heart start to slam, because this was it. This was the moment the mask came off. She'd been waiting for it for 6 weeks. Here it came. "I'm going to tell you the crack," he said. "Since you keep looking for it, I'm going to just hand it to you so you can stop hunting." Caleb: "No, you want it, here it is. The crack is this. I'm scared to death of you." He said it flat and plain, looking right at her. "I'm a man who built his whole life so it couldn't get knocked over again. After Claire, I decided no more. Just me and the boy and the shop and no surprises. Safe. Small. And it worked. Lena, it worked for 6 years. And I was fine. I told myself I was fine. And then a moving truck showed up across the street and you got out, holding a box, like your whole life was in it, and you weren't going to let anybody see how heavy it was. And I felt the ground move under me for the first time in 6 years, and I have been scared ever since. That's the crack. I'm not calm because nothing touches me. I'm calm because I'm holding on with everything I've got. Those are different things. You of all people should know they're different things." Lena stared at him. The whole picture rearranged itself in an instant. All those weeks she'd read him as the untouchable one, the steady one, the man with no wound, the one who had it all together and was generously spending some of it on her. And it had never once occurred to her that he was terrified too, that the coffee every morning had cost him something, that crossing the street was a risk for a man who'd built his life around never crossing streets. "You never showed it," she whispered, "because showing it wasn't the point. The point was you. You needed somebody steady more than I needed to fall apart, so I chose steady. That was a decision I made every single morning with the coffee. Choose steady, because she needs steady." He let out a breath. "But you keep looking for the crack, so there it is. I'm not fearless. I'm just willing to be scared and show up anyway. That's the only kind of brave I've got. It's the only kind that's real if you want to know the truth. The other kind, the fearless kind, that's just people who haven't got anything to lose yet." And Lena Hale, who had spent 14 months believing she was the broken one. The project, the charity case, the sad woman across the street being tended to by a whole man, understood all at once that she'd had it backwards. He wasn't whole and fixing her. They were both cracked, both scared, both holding on with everything they had, both choosing to show up anyway. And that she realized that was so much better than being rescued. Being rescued would have meant she was a thing to be saved. This was two frightened people deciding to be frightened together. "Kiss me," she said. She heard herself say it and could hardly believe it had come out of her mouth. Caleb went still. "Lena, I know I'm not ready. I know I said I wasn't ready. I'm probably still not ready. I might not be ready for a year. I might break your heart. I might break in half tomorrow morning. I'm giving you every warning I've got. But right now in this car on the side of the road with you telling me you're scared too. I have wanted one thing for 6 weeks and been too afraid to say it, and I'm tired of being too afraid. So kiss me. And if it's a mistake, we'll figure out the mistake together." Caleb reached across the car and put his hand along the side of her face. Careful, the way he was careful about everything, like she was cherry wood that would only get richer with the years. And he kissed her. And it was not an escape, and it was not a rescue, and it was not a man taking something. It was two people who'd both been left, both been taught they weren't worth staying for, finding out at the same time that the lesson had been a lie. When they broke apart, she was crying, and so she was astonished to see, was he just at the edges? The steady man with wet edges to his eyes, and neither of them wiped it away. "That wasn't a mistake," she said. "No," Caleb said rough. "That wasn't a mistake." He drove her the rest of the way home and walked her to her door, and at the door she almost asked him to stay, and he saw her almost ask, and he took her hand before she could. "Not tonight," he said gently. "You don't want to. I want to more than I've wanted anything in 6 years. That's exactly why not tonight." He pressed her knuckles to his mouth once. "You've spent a year learning that men take. I'm not going to take. When you're sure all the way, sure no scared tied underneath it, you'll tell me, and I'll be right across the street. There's no clock on it. There's no bill. I already told you that. Go on in. Lock your door. It's yours." And he waited on the porch until he heard the deadbolt turn the way he always did, and then she heard him walk down the steps and cross the street, and she stood with her back against her own door, in her blue dress, kissed for the first time in years by a man who'd just refused to come inside, and she understood that she had somehow found the one man in the world who would rather be sure she was safe than be satisfied himself, and she didn't know whether to laugh or cry, so she did both. Sliding down the door to sit on the floor of her mother's house, both at once in the dark. The next weeks were the good ones. She would think of them later as the good ones, the golden ones, the ones she'd almost not let herself have. Dinner became a standing thing. Friday nights always somewhere she got to be new. Danny became a fixture wandering across the street with Boots the Rabbit demanding books, and Lena read him every book in her house twice and then started buying new ones just for him. And she told herself she was buying them for him, and knew she was buying them for the ache in her chest that the boy kept pressing on the plan that had been taken away. The child she'd never have, and somehow the ache and the boy together made something that wasn't quite grief and wasn't quite joy, but was warmer than either. She started eating again. Really eating. Caleb never said a word about it, never once mentioned the too big clothes or the thinness, but he cooked, and he'd make enough for 3 without comment, and Danny would eat like a small starving wolf and shame her into keeping up. And one Friday, she looked down at herself buttoning the blue dress and realized it wasn't loose anymore. It fit. She had come back into her own body enough to fill her own dress, and she stood in front of the uncovered mirror and turned side to side and did not hate what she saw. And that was a mountain she hadn't even known she was climbing until she found herself standing on top of it. She bought new clothes. That was a whole event. She drove herself to the next town alone and walked into a store, and for the first time in years, she picked things because she liked them, not because they hid her, not because they made her small and unnoticeable, but because they had color and she wanted the color. She bought a yellow blouse so bright it was almost a dare. She wore it to the shop the next morning to bring Caleb his coffee for once, reversing their old ritual. And he looked up and saw her in the yellow, and just stopped Sander idling in his hand. "You're wearing yellow," he said. "Is it too much?" "There's no such thing as too much," Caleb said. "Not on you. I've spent 6 weeks watching you apologize for taking up space in the world. You wear all the yellow you want. Wear yellow till it hurts people's eyes. You've got a lot of gray years to make up for." And she laughed and set his coffee on the workbench, and it was such a small thing. a yellow blouse, and a cup of coffee going the other direction across the street. But it was everything. It was the whole recovery of a human being folded into one bright morning. And they both felt it, and neither of them made it heavy. But golden times don't hold. She'd learned that lesson too well to ever fully forget it, and the alarm in her was always half listening for the fall, and this time the fall didn't come from Marcus, which was almost worse. It came from her own body. It was a Tuesday. Time stamp it there, that ordinary Tuesday, because that's when the floor opened. She was in the shower, and her hand moved the way hands do automatic, the way any woman who's had what she's had learns to move her hands in the shower for the rest of her life. Checking, always checking, and her fingers found something. A lump. Small. On the other side, the side they hadn't taken. She stood in the shower with the water going cold and her fingers frozen against the small hard truth of it, and the entire world she'd spent 6 weeks rebuilding fell down around her all at once, silently, completely, the way a building comes down when the load-bearing wall goes. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. She went to the still blank place. The survivor's place. The place with no expression. The place Caleb had seen on her the very first day when she'd stood holding a box on the sidewalk, and she got out of the shower and dried off with steady hands, and got dressed and sat down on the edge of her bed and did not move for 2 hours. Because here was the thing. Here was the terrible arithmetic that ran in her head, cold and clear. She had just finally, after 14 months, let a man in. Let a little boy in. Let herself want something. Let herself fill out a blue dress and buy a yellow blouse and actually believe that she was a woman somebody would stay for. And now there was a lump. And she knew from experience what a lump did to a man. She had watched Marcus do the math over a hospital bed. She had watched a man she'd promised her life to look at a sick woman and decide she wasn't worth it. And Caleb had a son. Caleb had a 7-year-old boy who'd already lost one mother who kept a wall up, who didn't take to people who had taken to her in 4 minutes flat. And she was going to be what another sick woman for that little boy to watch. Maybe another one who left, except this time she wouldn't be choosing to leave this time. It might not be up to her at all. She could not do that to them. That was the thought that formed cold and complete on the edge of the bed. She could not let that little boy love her and then watch her get sick. She could not let Caleb, who'd built his whole life so it couldn't get knocked over, who was holding on with everything he had, who was scared to death of her, she could not let him pour himself into a woman who might be about to become exactly the thing he was most afraid of. She loved them too much. That was the whole logic of it, and it was airtight, and it was wrong, and she couldn't see that it was wrong because she was inside it. Inside the old lesson, the one that said the loving thing to do was to leave before you became a burden. So she decided to end it, to push them away, to do it now fast before the boy loved her any more than he already did, before Caleb sank in any deeper. She'd tell them it wasn't working. She'd be cold about it, cold enough that they wouldn't fight it, cold enough that it would stick. She was good at cold. Marcus had taught her cold. She could put the sheet back over herself for their sake. She didn't tell Caleb about the lump. That was the whole plan, and the plan depended on him never knowing, because if he knew, he'd do the thing he always did. He'd show up. He'd cross the street. He'd kneel down in it with her, and she could not let him, because she loved him too much to let him choose her, when choosing her might mean choosing a grave. She started the next morning. He brought the coffee, knocked once, and this time she opened the door before he could walk away, and he smiled, surprised and pleased, until he saw her face. He saw it in half a second, the way he always did. The blank place. The still, expressionless survivor's face. He hadn't seen it in weeks. It stopped him cold on her porch. "What happened?" he said immediately. "Nothing happened. I've just been thinking." She kept her voice flat. She'd practiced flat. "This is going too fast, Caleb. The dinner's Danny, all of it. It's too fast and I'm not. I was never ready. I told you I wasn't ready and I let it happen anyway, and that was a mistake. I think we should stop." Caleb didn't move. He stood very still, holding the coffee, reading her, and she could see him reading her, could see him looking for the truth under the words, the way he always did, and she made her face a wall. "That's not what happened," he said slowly. "It's exactly what happened. No. Something happened between Friday and now. Friday you were wearing yellow. Friday you laughed so hard at the frog story you cried. And now you've got that face on the box on the sidewalk face and you're telling me it's about pace." He set the coffee down on the porch rail, deliberately freeing his hands. "So I'm going to ask you again, and I want you to look at me when you answer. What happened?" "Nothing happened, Caleb. God, why can't you just let it be what I'm telling you it is? Because it's not true, and you're a bad liar, and I've spent 6 weeks learning your real face." His voice was still gentle, but there was iron under it now. "You want to end this. That's your right, it's always been your right. I told you there was no bill, and I meant it. But you're not going to end it with a lie. You want out. You look me in the eye and tell me the true reason. You owe me the true reason, not because of anything I did, because I never once lied to you, not one time in 6 weeks, and the least you can do is not start now." And that cracked her, because it was true, he never had lied to her, not once. And here she was doing to him the exact thing Marcus used to do to her, weaponizing a false story, making him doubt what he could plainly see, telling him it's about pace, when it was about something else entirely, gaslighting the one man who'd never done it to her, and the horror of catching herself doing Marcus's move made her whole wall shake. "Don't do this," she whispered. "Please. I'm trying to do the right thing. For once in my life, I'm trying to do the right thing, and you're making it so hard." "How is lying to me the right thing?" "Because I'm trying to protect you." It came out before she could stop it, torn out of her too loud, and it hung in the morning air between them, and Caleb went very still. "Protect me from what?" he said quietly, and she couldn't hold it. 6 weeks of him watching her real face. 6 weeks of a man who paid attention, and she'd never once managed to keep anything from him for long, and she couldn't now either, and it came out of her in a rush, wrecked the wall coming down all at once. "I found a lump." Her voice broke into pieces on it. "Tuesday, in the shower, on the other side. The side they didn't take. And I know what comes next. Caleb, I've been through the whole thing. I know exactly what comes next. The tests and the waiting, and maybe the surgery, and maybe worse. And I watched a man do the math on me once already. I stood in a hospital gown and watched my husband decide I wasn't worth it. And I will not do that to you. And I will not do it to Danny. That little boy lost one mother already, and he took 4 minutes to love me. And I am not going to let him love me, and then watch me get sick. I am not going to be another woman who leaves that child, even if I don't want to leave, even if the leaving isn't up to me. I love you both too much. That's why. That's the true reason. I'm trying to leave you before I become the thing you're most afraid of. So please, please just let me go and be angry at me and forget me and keep your safe little life the way you built it. Please." She was sobbing by the end of it, standing in her own doorway, having handed him the whole terrible truth, and she waited for him to do the thing. Every part of her expected the thing her whole history had taught her men did. She waited for him to take the out, to be relieved underneath the sad face, to do the math and back away slow, to be a coward like all of them, because that was what the world had taught her men were. Caleb was quiet for a long moment. Then he stepped forward over the threshold into her house, and he took her face in both his hands, and he made her look at him. "Now you listen to me," he said, and his voice was shaking, but it wasn't shaking from fear. It was shaking from something else, something fierce. "You listen to me good, because I'm only going to say this once, and then I'm going to say it every day for the rest of your life. You do not get to leave me to protect me. That's not protection. That's just leaving with a nicer story on it. You've been left before with an ugly story, and now you want to do the leaving yourself with a pretty story and call it love. And it is not love. Lena, it is fear wearing love's coat, and I have worn that exact coat, and I know it when I see it. Caleb, I'm not finished. You found a lump. Okay, then here's what happens. We go to the doctor. Not you. We. And we find out what it is. And if it's nothing, we have a good cry and go get pancakes. And if it's something, if it's the worst something, then I'll tell you exactly what happens then, because you keep thinking you know, and you keep having it wrong. What happens then is I drive you to every appointment, and I sit in every waiting room, and I hold the bad news with you, and I hold the good news with you, and I do not do the math because I already did the math. Lena, I did it weeks ago. I did it the first time you read my boy a book on your living room floor, and the math came out that there is no version of my life that's better without you in it. Sick or well, whole or scared. There's no math where I come out ahead by running. I ran the numbers. I'm a careful man, I ran them twice. You lose. She was staring at him, drowning, unable to breathe. But Danny gets to love people who might get sick, Caleb said. That's called being alive. I'm not going to teach my son that you only love the people who come with a guarantee, because there's no such person. There's no guarantee on anybody. I could get hit by a truck crossing this street tomorrow morning with your coffee. You want to teach that boy that the right thing to do when somebody might get sick is to leave them so it hurts less later. Because that's Marcus's lesson. That's exactly Marcus's lesson. And I would rather my son watch me love a sick woman with everything I've got than watch me protect myself by walking away. One of those makes him a man. The other one makes him Marcus. And that last thing broke the whole false architecture of her plan into dust, because she saw it. She finally saw it, that leaving to protect them was the same move as Marcus doing the math. Just dressed up in sacrifice, just wearing love's coat, and that Caleb was refusing to let her become the thing that had broken her. Refusing to let her hand that lesson to a child, refusing to let fear win one more time in her one precious life. I'm so scared, she said, and it was the truest thing she'd said in 14 months, truer than anything the whole thing reduced to its bones. Caleb, I'm so scared. I know, he said, and he pulled her into him, and he held her, all of her, the sick and the well and the scared and the yellow blouse brave, all of it in the doorway of her mother's house. I know you are, so am I. We're going to be scared together. That's the whole deal. That's the only deal there ever was. Nobody gets the version without the scared. We just get to pick who we're scared with. She cried into his clean shirt, the one without the sawdust, and got it wet through, and he didn't move. He just held on steady, load-bearing, and over her shoulder. Through the open door, he could see his own house across the street, where his boy was still sleeping. And he held the woman and looked at the house that held the child. Everything he had in the world, all of it on one small street, all of it fragile, all of it worth being scared for. Okay, she said finally into his chest. Okay, we go to the doctor. We, Caleb said. Together. Wednesday. I already know a good one. 2 towns over. I'll drive. He pulled back just enough to look at her, and he wiped her face with his thumb gentle. And there was the ghost of that smile, the one that changed his whole face. And you're going to wear the yellow. To the doctor. I don't care if it's not doctor clothes. You're going to walk into that office in the loudest yellow you own, so that whatever they tell us in there, you walk in as the woman who came all the way back. Not the woman on the sidewalk with the box. The other one. Deal. And Lena Hale, standing in the wreckage of a plan built entirely out of fear, held together by a man who'd refused to let her run, looked up at him through the ruin of her own face, and felt the fear still there, still real, still enormous, and felt something else standing right beside it. Now, something she'd almost thrown away that very morning, something that had a hand in her hand and wasn't letting go. Deal, she said. I'll wear the yellow. She wore the yellow. Wednesday morning, she stood in front of the mirror she no longer covered and buttoned the bright yellow blouse, and her hands shook the whole time, and she made them keep going anyway. When Caleb pulled up out front at 8 on the dot, because he was always on the dot, she came out her door and down her steps in the loudest yellow she owned, and he got out of the car and came around and opened her door for her, and he didn't say anything about the fear all over her face. He just looked at the yellow and nodded once like a man confirming a soldier had shown up in uniform. "There she is," he said quietly. "I feel like I might throw up." "That's allowed. Throw up in the yellow. It's a forgiving color." And she laughed a small cracked laugh, and it was exactly what she needed. And he knew it was exactly what she needed, and that was why he'd said it. The drive took 40 minutes. She was quiet most of it, and he let her be quiet, and about halfway there she reached over without a word and put her hand on his knee, just to hold on to something. And he took one hand off the wheel and covered hers, and didn't make a thing of it. When they got there, he parked and turned the car off, and neither of them moved for a second. "Whatever's in there," Caleb said. "We walk out the same door we walked in, together. That part's already decided. The only thing we don't know yet is the weather. But we already know we've got the same umbrella. You understand me?" "I understand you." "Say it back, the part that matters." "We walk out together." Her voice wobbled. "No matter the weather." "That's the whole thing." He squeezed her hand. "Come on, let's go find out." The waiting room was the worst part, and Lena knew it would be the worst part because she'd lived in waiting rooms before, and waiting rooms are where the mind does its cruelest work. She'd sat in rooms exactly like this one before, alone, always alone, because Marcus had a way of being needed at the office on the days that mattered most, a way of saying he'd meet her there and then texting that something came up, and she'd learned to receive terrible news by herself and drive herself home and be composed by dinner so as not to burden anybody with it. She'd gotten her original diagnosis alone in a room like this one. She'd driven herself home from that and made dinner, and Marcus had asked how the appointment went, and she'd said fine while she was still deciding whether to tell him she had cancer because she already knew even then that the telling would somehow become about him. His fear, his inconvenience, and she'd have to manage it. So, the waiting room brought all of that up. The whole history of being sick alone, and she felt herself start to slide toward the still blank place, the survivor's nowhere. And then, Caleb beside her took a small notebook out of his shirt pocket and a stub of carpenter's pencil, and he started to sketch. "What are you doing?" she said. "Building you something in my head. I do it when I'm nervous. Always have." He turned the notebook a little so she could see. He was drawing a bench. "You know that spot in your backyard by the window gets the morning light. I keep thinking that corner wants a reading bench, something low. Wide enough you could sit sideways with your feet up. Danny could sit on one end with his books, you on the other with yours. Cherry, I think. It'll go red over the years." And she understood exactly what he was doing. He was doing the thing he always did. He was building a future out loud in a waiting room at the worst moment, so that her mind would have somewhere to stand that wasn't the edge of the cliff. He wasn't saying it'll be fine, don't worry, because he didn't lie to her, and he wasn't going to start with a lie in a waiting room. He was doing something braver than a lie. He was building a bench for a woman he didn't yet know had a future on faith in pencil and daring the day to prove him wrong. "You're drawing a bench," she said, and her voice broke. "Because you're scared." "I'm drawing a bench," Caleb said, not looking up from it. "Because I want you to have somewhere to sit for the next 30 years, and I figure I'd better get the plans right." He kept shading in the cherry. "You want armrests or no armrests?" "Caleb, armrests or no, it's a real question. It's your bench." She looked at this man drawing a 30-year bench in a cancer clinic waiting room, and she felt the cliff edge pull back just enough just to where she could breathe. "No armrests," she said. "So Danny can lie all the way across it. No armrests." He wrote it down. "Good call, that's the right call." And he kept drawing, and she kept watching him draw, and the nurse called her name before the fear could get its hooks all the way back in. And she stood up in her yellow blouse, and Caleb stood up with her. "You want me in there?" he said. "Or you want to go in alone? Both are okay. Your call. It's your body and your room." And that undid her a little too, because Marcus had never once asked. Marcus had either not shown up at all or had come in and taken over, talked to the doctors over her head, asked his questions like her body was a car he'd brought in for service, and here was Caleb handing her the choice. Her body, her room, her call. "Come in," she said. "Please. I don't want to hear it alone. I've heard everything alone. I don't want to do it alone anymore." "Then you never will again," Caleb said, and he followed her in. The doctor was a woman about their age, kind-eyed, careful with her words, and she examined Lena and asked questions, and Lena answered them, and Caleb sat in the corner chair and said nothing, and just was there, a steady presence at the edge of the room, and Lena kept glancing at him, and he kept being there, and it was the strangest thing to be examined and afraid, and still somehow held just by a man being in a chair. Then came the part where they had to wait for the imaging. And that was another waiting room, a smaller one, and this time Lena didn't slide toward the blank place at all, because she'd learned something in the last hour. She'd learned that the waiting was survivable if you weren't alone in it. So instead of going away in her head, she stayed and she talked. "Can I tell you something," she said, "that I've never told anybody?" "Always. When they told me the first time, the original diagnosis, before all of it." She twisted her hands in her lap. "I was alone in the room like always, and the doctor said the word, and you know what my very first thought was? My very first thought before scared, before anything was, now I have to figure out how to tell Marcus in a way that won't upset him too much. That was my first thought about my own cancer. How to manage his feelings about it. I had a tumor, and my first instinct was to protect the man who was supposed to protect me." She looked up. "That's how far gone I was. That's what 11 years does. You get cancer, and your first thought is about somebody else's comfort." Caleb was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, his voice was low and even, but there was something hard in it, hard and sad. "You know what that tells me," he said. "That tells me you'd already been sick a lot longer than the tumor. The tumor was just the part they could find on a scan. And Lena sat with that because it was true. It was so true, it took the breath out of her that she'd been sick for years before the cancer sick, in a way no scan would find, and that the marriage had been the disease, and the cancer had just been the marriage finally showing up somewhere, a machine could see it. "Nobody ever put it that way," she said. "Well, somebody should have." He reached over and took her hand. "This time, you're going to hear whatever they say with somebody in the room who's already decided to stay. So whatever it is, you don't have to figure out how to tell me gently. You don't have to manage me. I'm a grown man, I can carry my own feelings. You just have to have the feelings that are yours, that's all. That's the only job you've got in there. Have your own feelings. I've got mine covered." They called her back for the imaging, and then there was more waiting. And then the doctor came in with a folder, and Lena's whole body went to ice because she knew that walk. She knew the folder walk, and Caleb felt her go rigid beside him and took her hand in both of his. The doctor sat down. She looked at them both. And Lena thought, here it is. Here's the fall, and she braced and she squeezed Caleb's hand so hard it must have hurt him, and he didn't pull away. "It's a cyst," the doctor said. For a second, the words didn't land. Lena had braced so hard for the worst that the not worst couldn't get through. "It's a benign cyst," the doctor said again, gently seeing her face. "Fluid-filled, completely benign. Given your history, I understand exactly why you were terrified. And you were absolutely right to come in immediately. Always come in immediately. But this is not cancer. This is a cyst. We can drain it today if it's bothering you, or we can just watch it. But it is not what you were afraid of. You're okay, Lena. You're okay." And Lena Hale, who had come in that morning having already planned her own death, and the leaving of the two people she loved, who had built a whole cold sacrifice out of fear on the edge of her bed, who had worn the loudest yellow she owned into a room she was sure would end her, made a sound that wasn't crying and wasn't laughing, but was both, and folded forward, and Caleb caught her and held her, and over the top of her head, he looked at the doctor and mouthed, "Thank you." And the doctor smiled and quietly left them alone in the room. "It's a cyst," Lena said into his shirt, disbelieving. "It's a cyst. Caleb, it's a cyst." "It's a cyst," he said, and his voice was thick, and when she pulled back to look at him, the steady man had tears running straight down his face, Not just at the edges this time, all the way down, and he wasn't wiping them. "It's a cyst. You're okay. You're okay. Oh, thank God. You're okay." "You cried," she said, wondering. "Course I cried. I've been holding it since Wednesday, same as you. I just had a job to do, so I held it. Now the job's done." He laughed, wet and undone. "Now I get to fall apart a little. You want to know the truth? I've been drawing benches in my head for 2 days, because if I stopped drawing, I was going to lose it. That bench has got the most detailed plans of anything I've ever built. It's got the joinery figured out down to the last peg, because every time I got scared, I added a detail. It's a very well-designed bench, Lena. It's the most scared bench in America." And she laughed and cried, and they sat in the little exam room laughing and crying together. Two people who'd walked in braced for a grave and were walking out with a cyst and a bench. And it was, she would think later, the single best moment of her adult life, that ridiculous holy moment in a paper gown room, being okay and not being alone for it. They didn't drain it that day. She decided she wanted to just watch it, and the doctor agreed that was reasonable, and they walked out of the clinic. The same door they'd walked in together, exactly as promised, and the light outside seemed impossibly bright, and Lena stood in the parking lot in her yellow blouse and turned her face up to the sun and just breathed, and Caleb stood beside her and let her breathe. "Pancakes," he said finally. "You promised. If it was nothing pancakes and a good cry. We've done the cry. Now we owe ourselves the pancakes. It's 2 in the afternoon. Pancakes don't have a clock, Lena. That's the whole beauty of pancakes." So they got pancakes at 2 in the afternoon in a diner 2 towns over, and she ate a full stack every bite, and he watched her eat it, and didn't say a word about how a month ago she couldn't have finished a piece of toast. And somewhere in the middle of the pancakes, she started laughing, for no reason at all. Just laughing because she was alive and okay, and eating pancakes with a man who'd drawn her a bench, and the laughing was so pure and so uncontrolled that the waitress came over to check on them, and then just smiled and left the coffee pot on the table. That night, back on her street, he walked her to her door, same as always, and she stood in her doorway, and this time, when the almost question rose up in her, she didn't push it down. "Stay," she said. Caleb went still. "Lena, I know what you said. I know your rule. When I'm sure, all the way sure, no scared tied underneath it." She stepped closer to him. "I spent the last 2 days thinking I was going to die, Caleb. And you know what I found out? I regretted not the things I did, the things I was too scared to do. I regretted every single time I let fear pick for me. And I'm not doing it anymore. I'm sure. All the way sure. There's no scared tide underneath it. There's just me standing in my own doorway asking the man I love to stay. So stay." She'd said it. The word. Love. It had come out on its own, folded inside the sentence, and she heard it land, and she watched him hear it. "You said love," Caleb said quietly. "I did. Say it by itself, not tucked into something else. I want to hear it stand on its own 2 feet. And Lena Hale, who 14 months ago had put sheets over her mirrors, who 6 weeks ago had told a stranger nobody wanted her, who that very morning had planned to leave the 2 people she loved most, to spare them the sight of her dying, stood in her own doorway, in her yellow blouse, and said it plain out loud, standing on its own 2 feet. "I love you, Caleb Morgan." He crossed the threshold, and he kissed her. And this time, there was no rule, no not tonight, no careful distance, and he stayed, and it was not a rescue, and it was not an escape, and it was not a man taking it. Was 2 people who'd both been left, both been taught they weren't worth staying for. Finally staying. She woke before him the next morning, which never happened. He was always up at 6, but he'd slept deep and easy, and she lay there in the early light and looked at him sleeping and felt something she had no name for, something that wasn't the giddy high of the night before, but was underneath it and steadier, something that felt like the difference between a fire and a foundation. She'd had fire before, she'd never had the other thing, and she understood lying there that the other thing was what she'd actually been starving for all those years. Not passion, she'd had passion. Marcus could be passionate. Passion was cheap. What she'd starved for was somebody who'd still be there in the flat, gray light of an ordinary Thursday, sleeping easy in her bed having crossed the street. She got up quiet and made coffee and brought it back to bed, reversing the ritual all the way. And when he woke to the smell of it, and to her sitting beside him, he looked for 1 second like a man who couldn't believe his luck, like a man who'd built his life small on purpose and woken up in a bigger one. "You made me coffee," he said, rough with sleep. 6 weeks you brought me coffee. Figured it was my turn to hold up the other end. He sat up and took the cup and looked at her over the rim of it, and something crossed his face, something serious, and she braced a little out of old habit, and he saw her brace and shook his head. "It's not a bad thing," he said. "Stop bracing. It's a good thing. It's just a big one." He set the coffee down. "Danny asked me something last night, before I came over. He asked me if you were going to be around for a while, and I said I hoped so. And he thought about it. You know how he thinks real serious, and he said good because he likes reading books with you better than reading them with me because you do the voices better." Caleb almost laughed. "Which is true. You do the voices better. I'm a terrible voice doer, but that's not the point. The point is, my boy asked if you were going to stay. And I've never had to think before about what I'd say if a person I brought into his life didn't stay. Because I never brought anybody in. 6 years, Lena. I never once brought a woman around that boy. You're the first." "Caleb, I'm not asking you for anything," he said, the old refrain, the one she knew by heart now. "No, Bill, I need you to know what it means. That he asked. That I let him get attached. I don't do that. I built my whole life so I'd never have to do that. And I did it anyway for you, eyes open, knowing the risk because you were worth the risk. So when you say, you're sure, all the way sure, I need it to be true because it's not just my heart on the table anymore. It's a 7-year-old's. And that's the one thing in this world I don't play games with." And Lena set down her own coffee and took his face in her hands the way he'd taken hers in the doorway the morning of the lump, and she made him look at her. "I am not going to leave that boy," she said, and every word of it came up from the deepest and truest place in her. "Do you hear me? I have spent my whole life being left and being taught to leave, and I am done. The chain stops with me. I am not going to be one more grown-up who taught Danny Morgan that people go away. I'm going to be the one who stayed. I'm going to do the voices in the books until he's too old for books, and then I'm going to do them anyway, just to embarrass him in front of his friends. I'm sure, Caleb, not just about you, about him, about all of it. I'm sure." And Caleb Morgan, the careful man, the man who ran the numbers twice, looked at her a long moment, and then he nodded slow, and she watched something in him let go some brace he'd been holding for 6 years, maybe longer, and he pulled her in and held her, and they sat in the gray Thursday light holding each other, and it was so quiet. The good quiet, the quiet Marcus could never stand. The quiet that meant two people were simply in a room together, being real. Then the phone rang. It was on the nightstand, her phone, and the name on it froze them both. Marcus. Of course. Of course now, of all the mornings, the morning after the one perfect morning. She looked at it and felt the old cold reach for her, that reflex, that duck of the head, and she felt Caleb tense beside her, ready to take it from her if she wanted, ready to stand between her and it, the way he'd stood between her and the car. But she didn't hand him the phone. She picked it up herself, and she looked at Caleb, and she smiled, and there was no fear in the smile at all, and she answered it on speaker so there'd be no secrets in the room. So Caleb could hear every word because she was done with the kind of life that had to be managed in private. "Marcus," she said. "Lena." Finally. His voice, that voice warm and terrible. "Listen, I've been thinking. About us. About everything. I think we were too hasty. I think we both said things. And I've been talking to some people, and I really think that with some work we could—" "Marcus," Lena said, and her voice was calmer than she'd ever been with him in her life, calm all the way down. "I have to stop you. I'm going to tell you 3 things, and then I'm going to hang up, and this is the last time we're going to talk. That isn't through lawyers." Silence on the line. He wasn't used to being interrupted. She'd never once interrupted him in 11 years. "First thing," she said, "I found a lump on Tuesday, and for 2 days I thought I was dying. And I did not think about you once. Not once, Marcus. For the first time in my life, I got scared for my own body, and your name never even came up in my head. That's how I know I'm free. It's not the divorce papers. It's that my fear doesn't have your name in it anymore. Lena, if you're sick, then we should really..." Second thing. It's a cyst. It's benign. I'm okay. And I found that out yesterday sitting next to a man who drew me a bench in the waiting room because he was too scared to sit still. A man who came in the room with me, who told me I didn't have to manage his feelings. Do you know I never had that? In 11 years, I got cancer and drove myself home and made you dinner. And I never even noticed how strange that was until somebody showed me what the other thing looks like. Caleb was very still beside her, listening, his jaw tight. "Who is he?" Marcus said, and the warmth was gone now, the cold coming up underneath the real Marcus. "Is he there right now? Is he listening to this? Is that what this is?" Third thing, Lena said, ignoring it completely, and this was the one. This was the thing she'd been walking toward for 14 months without knowing it. "You spent 11 years telling me nobody would want me. You didn't say it in words. You were too smart for words. You said it by going quiet, by doing the math over my hospital bed, by making me put sheets over my own mirrors. You taught me that I was a thing that used to be worth something and had gone bad like milk. And I believed you. I believed you so hard I moved into my dead mother's house and stopped looking at my own face. So here's the third thing, Marcus, and then I'm hanging up. You were wrong. Somebody did want me. Somebody wanted the whole me, the scared me and the scarred me and the sick me, before we even knew it was just a cyst. Somebody looked at exactly what you threw away and called it the best thing that ever crossed his street. So you were wrong. That's it. That's the whole thing I needed to say to you for 11 years and never could. You were wrong about me. Goodbye, Marcus." And she hung up. And then she turned the phone off entirely and set it face down and looked at Caleb. And Caleb was looking at her like a man who'd just watched something rise up out of the ground that he'd been told was dead. And neither of them said anything for a second. "I've been waiting 11 years to say that," Lena said. "I didn't even know it was the thing until it came out." "How do you feel?" Caleb said. She checked honestly the way she'd learned to check. She waited for the crash. The shaking, the whine reflex, the sheet over the mirror. It didn't come. There was nothing under it but quiet, the good quiet, and a strange lightness, like she'd set down a box she'd been carrying so long, she'd forgotten it was a choice to put it down. "Light," she said, surprised. "I feel light. I thought I'd feel something big and terrible. I just feel light." "That's what it feels like," Caleb said, "when you stop carrying somebody who was never carrying you back." She looked at him, this man in her bed in the gray Thursday light, this man who'd brought her coffee for 6 weeks and asked for nothing, who'd knelt in her broken glass, who'd drawn a bench in a cancer clinic, who'd refused to let her leave him to protect him, who'd told her he was scared and stayed anyway. "I have a question for you," she said. "And there's no right answer, and there's no bill, I'm just asking." "Ask." "The bench, the one from the waiting room, the most scared bench in America." She smiled. "Are you actually going to build it? Or was it just something to draw?" Caleb reached over to the nightstand where he'd set his shirt, and out of the pocket he pulled the little notebook, and he opened it to the page, the bench, the cherry bench with no armrests, so Danny could lie all the way across it, and he handed it to her. "I'm going to build it," he said. "I already ordered the cherry. Called it in yesterday from the diner while you were in the bathroom washing pancake off your face. It'll be here Monday." He looked at her steady, the whole of him in it. "I'm going to build you a bench that goes red over 30 years, Lena. And I'm going to set it in that corner of your yard that gets the morning light. And you're going to sit on it and read books with a boy who thinks you do the voices better than his own father. For 30 years. That's the plan. That's the whole plan. You want to change any of it, now's the time. And Lena Hale looked down at the pencil drawing of a 30-year bench drawn by a scared man in a waiting room where she'd thought she was going to die, and she looked up at the man himself. And she found that there was nothing in the plan she wanted to change. Not one peg of it, not one joint. "No," she said, and her voice was full. "Don't change anything. Build it exactly like that." "No armrests," he said. "No armrests." She agreed. "So the boy can lie all the way across." The cherry came Monday, just like he said it would. Lena watched from her porch as the delivery truck pulled up in front of Caleb's shop, and two men unloaded long boards wrapped in paper, and Caleb signed for them and ran a hand down the length of one, the way another man might greet a horse. He looked up and caught her watching and held up a board like a trophy, and she laughed, and it carried across the street, and Danny came barreling out of the shop to inspect the wood with the same gravity his father gave it, and Lena stood on her porch with her coffee and watched the two of them. The man and the boy bent over a stack of lumber, and she thought, "That's mine now. That's my street. That's my morning. I get to keep this." She still had to catch herself sometimes. The old alarm still went off. She'd feel too happy and wait for the bill, and then she'd remember there was no bill. There had never been a bill, and she'd let the happiness stay. It was getting easier. Every day it got a little easier. She realized one morning, becoming a person who expected good things to last, and she hadn't been that person since she was a girl, running barefoot down this same street. And getting her back was slow work, but it was working. He built the bench in the evenings after Danny was down in the shop with the lights on, and sometimes she'd cross the street with 2 coffees and just sit on a stool and watch him work. He was different when he worked. Quieter if that was possible, but not the guarded quiet, a different quiet, an absorbed one. His whole attention poured down into his hands. She'd never had anybody's whole attention before. Marcus's attention had always been half somewhere else calculating, and here was a man who could disappear entirely into a joint of wood, and she found she loved watching him disappear into it, because she knew that when he turned that same complete attention on her, and he did every day, it was the realest thing she'd ever felt. "You do that with me too," she said one night, watching him fit 2 pieces together. "Do what?" This thing where you go all the way in, where the whole of you shows up." She wrapped her hands around her coffee. Marcus was never all the way anywhere. Even when he was in the room, he was half gone. I used to think that was just what men were like, half gone. I thought a woman was lucky to get half. Caleb set down the piece he was holding. "A woman's not lucky to get half," he said. "A woman gets the whole thing, or it's not worth the wood it's printed on. You spent 11 years being grateful for half. I'd like to spend the next 30 ruining you for half entirely, so that if I ever slip up and give you less than the whole of me, you notice right away, and you call me on it, because you'll have forgotten how to accept anything less." That's a dangerous promise. It's the only kind worth making. And he went back to the wood, and she watched him, and she understood that she was being slowly, deliberately, patiently ruined for anything less than everything, and that it was the best thing anybody had ever done for her. The bench took 3 weeks. He wouldn't rush it. She teased him about it, said the boy would be in college before it was done, and he said good things went red slow, and there was no hurrying Cherry, and she understood he was talking about her again, the way he was always half talking about her, and she let him. The day he finished it, he didn't tell her. He and Danny carried it across the street while she was out at the store, and they set it in the corner of her backyard that got the morning light. Exactly the corner he'd pointed to in the waiting room the day she thought she was dying. And when she came home and walked around back, there it was. Cherry, low, wide, no armrests. A bench built by a scared man over 3 weeks of evenings sitting in the light like it had grown there. She stood and looked at it for a long time. Danny was sitting on one end already, feet swinging, a book open in his lap waiting for her. Because of course he was. Because the whole thing had been designed around him, lying across it. And Caleb stood off to the side with his hands in his pockets, watching her face the way he always watched her face. "Well," he said, "there it is, the most scared bench in America." Lena couldn't speak for a second. She walked over and put her hand on the wood pale and honey-colored the color it would spend 30 years leaving behind on its slow way to red. And she thought about the drawing in the waiting room. The pencil lines a man had made because if he stopped drawing he'd lose it. And here it was, real solid load-bearing, a future somebody had built on faith before he knew she had one. "Come sit," Danny said, patting the wood beside him. "I saved you the good end. You do the wolf voice. Dad's wolf is terrible. It sounds like a cow." "My wolf is excellent," Caleb said. "It sounds like a cow," Danny said with the flat certainty of a 7-year-old, and Lena laughed so hard she had to sit down, which was the point. So she sat down on the good end of the bench a man had built her next to a boy who'd saved her the good end, and she did the wolf voice, and it was a very good wolf voice, and Danny declared it official, and Caleb stood in the corner of a yard that got the morning light and watched his whole world sit on one bench, and he didn't say anything because there wasn't anything to say that the picture didn't already say better. That was the spring. The summer was better. Lena painted the inside of the house, all of it, and when she got to the kitchen, the room with the window she'd once thrown a wine glass at her own reflection through, she stood in the paint aisle for 20 minutes and then chose yellow. Bright yellow. Loud yellow. The kind of yellow a woman picks when she's done apologizing for taking up space in the world. "It's a lot of yellow," Caleb said when he saw it. "There's no such thing as too much," she said, quoting him back at himself. "You told me that." "I did tell you that." He looked at the walls, the loud, bright walls of a room that had once held her worst night, and something moved in his face. "It's the right color, Lena. It's exactly the right color for that room. That room earned some yellow." And she knew he was remembering it too. The glass, the floor, the kneeling, the "where else would I go?" And she came and stood next to him in the loud yellow kitchen, and neither of them said anything about that night. They didn't have to, they just stood in the color she'd painted over it, and it was enough. Her cousin called that summer. The one who'd called Marcus, who'd told him there was some handyman taking advantage of the vulnerable divorcee. Lena almost didn't pick up. Then she did. "I heard you're seeing someone," her cousin said in the careful voice. The worried voice, the voice that was really just nosiness wearing concern's coat. I worry about you, Lena. You've been through so much, and a man like that, a laborer with a child moving so fast, I just don't want to see you get hurt again while you're fragile." And Lena, who a year ago would have shrunk under every word of that, apologized for worrying. Everyone defended herself, tried to earn the right to her own happiness, felt none of it. She felt instead a kind of clean, distant pity for the woman on the phone, who couldn't imagine a good thing that wasn't a trap. "I'm not fragile," Lena said. "And he's not a laborer. He's a craftsman. And even if he were a laborer, that would be fine because he's the finest man I've ever known. And we're not moving fast. We're moving exactly the right speed. You'd know the difference if you'd ever been moved slow by somebody who meant it." She paused. "I know you called Marcus. I know you told him about Caleb. I'm not angry. I just want you to know, I know, and I want you to know it didn't work. And I want you to know that the next time you feel worried about me, the kind thing, the actual kind thing would be to just be happy for me. That's all I ever needed from anybody. Somebody to just be happy for me without a bill attached." There was a silence on the line, and then her cousin, quieter, the concern costume slipping off, said, "You sound different." "I am different." "No, I mean you sound like you did. Before. When we were young. You sound like Lena again." And Lena Hale stood in her loud yellow kitchen and felt tears come up, the good kind, because that was the thing. Wasn't it? That was the whole thing she'd been trying to get back for 14 months without a name for it. Not thinner, not prettier, not fixed. Herself. She sounded like herself again. "Yeah," she said softly. "Yeah, I think I do. Be happy for me, okay? That's all. Just be happy for me." "Okay," her cousin said, and for once it sounded real. "Okay. I'm happy for you, Lena." The mirrors, all of them, stayed uncovered now. That was a thing she noticed one day, and it stopped her in her tracks that she'd stopped noticing the mirrors at all, that she walked past them a dozen times a day, without a thought that a piece of glass had gone back to being just a piece of glass. She stood in front of the big one in the hall, the first one she'd uncovered that terrified night, and she looked at herself. The gray at her temples, the body that had survived the woman who filled out her own clothes now. And she remembered saying to this same reflection once, "No one wants you," and throwing a glass at it. Somebody wanted you, she told the woman in the mirror now, and it wasn't a test anymore. It wasn't trying the shape of it. It was just true. Somebody wanted the whole thing, and you let him. That was the brave part, not surviving. Any fool can survive. You let yourself be wanted. That's the thing you almost couldn't do. And you did it. The woman in the mirror looked back, and she was smiling, and it was not a smile learned from surviving. It was the other kind, the kind that reaches all the way up into the eyes. The kind Lena thought she'd buried in a hospital gown 14 months before, and had turned out only to have misplaced. They moved slow the way he'd promised, exactly the right speed. It was almost a year before he asked her, and he didn't do it fancy because Caleb didn't do fancy. Fancy was Marcus's language, the grand gesture that covered an empty room. Caleb did it on the bench. A morning in early fall, the cherry just barely beginning to turn the first hint of the red. It would spend 30 years becoming, and Danny was at school, and they were sitting on the good end, and the other end, with coffee. And Caleb reached into his shirt pocket, the same pocket the bench drawing had come out of, and took out a ring. It wasn't big. It was simple, a plain band, the kind of ring a careful man picks, a ring built to last and not to impress. "I'm not going to make a speech," he said. "You've had enough speeches from men. Marcus was all speech. So I'm just going to say the true thing plain, the way I try to say everything to you. I want to marry you. Not the healed version of you. Not the fixed version. Not the version that never gets scared or never covers a mirror or never plans to run when she's terrified. All of it. The whole woman. The scared parts too. I want to be the man who's across the table from you for the rest of it, whatever the rest of it is, sick or well-read or pale. And I want Danny to grow up in a house where a woman does the voices better than his father. And I want to build things in a shop and come home to yellow walls. And I want 30 years on this bench watching it go red. And then I want 30 more if we get them. That's the whole speech I said I wasn't going to make. Marry me, Lena. There's no bill. There was never a bill. Just marry me." And Lena Hale looked at the plain ring in the rough hand of the man who'd knelt in her broken glass, who'd drawn her a bench in a room where she thought she'd die, who'd refused to let her leave him to protect him, who'd taught her patiently, morning by morning, coffee by coffee, that she was worth staying for. And she did not hesitate, not for a second, not for the length of a breath, because the woman who hesitated, the woman who braced for the bill, the woman who put sheets over mirrors, that woman was gone, and the one sitting on the bench in her place knew exactly what she wanted and was done being afraid to want it. "Yes," she said. "Yes, put it on. Yes." He put it on. His hands were shaking, the steady man shaking, and she loved that he still shook for her, that he was still willing to be scared and show up anyway, that being brave for him had never once meant not being afraid. And when it was on, she looked at it on her hand, plain and simple, and built to last. And then she looked up at him, and she said the thing she'd been carrying since the morning of the cyst, the thing she finally understood all the way down. "You know when I knew," she said. "It wasn't the kiss, it wasn't the dinner, it wasn't even you refusing to let me run when I found the lump, though that was close." She took his hand in both of hers. "It was the bench, in the waiting room. When you drew me 30 years before, you knew I had 30 days. Everybody I ever loved waited to see if I was worth it first. Waited for the tests, waited to do the math. And you built me a future in pencil on faith before you had a single reason to believe I'd get one. Nobody ever bet on me before they saw the cards. You bet everything blind in a room full of bad news. That's when I knew. That's the whole moment. You built the bench before you knew I'd live to sit on it." Caleb was quiet for a moment. And then he said the thing that closed it, the thing she'd carry the rest of her life. The answer to the question the whole story had been asking from the first night he heard glass shatter across a dark street. "You want to know when I knew," he said. "People are going to ask us, you know. For 30 years they're going to ask how we knew. And they're going to expect me to say the kiss or the wedding or some pretty moment. But I already know what I'm going to tell them. Every time. He held her face in his hand the way he had that first terrible night on her kitchen floor. I'm going to tell them it was the night I heard a glass break across the street, and I found a woman on her floor telling herself nobody wanted her, and she told me to get out. And I stayed anyway. That's when I knew. Not because she was broken and I could fix her. I don't fix people. Lena, I fix chairs. I knew because even down there in the glass at your absolute worst, telling me to leave, there was something in you that was worth staying for, and I could see it even when you couldn't, and I decided right then on that floor that I was going to keep seeing it until you learned to see it too. And I did, Lena said, her voice full. I learned to see it. You did? You learned it slow. The best things go red slow. He smiled that full smile that changed his whole face. The moment you told me nobody wanted you, he said, and I stayed anyway. That's the answer. That's when I knew. And I'm going to be telling people that answer from this bench for the next 30 years, while it turns red under us, with a boy who thinks you do the voices better than me, in a house with walls too yellow on a street that's yours now, married to a woman who finally learned she was worth staying for. And Lena Hale, who had once stood in a dark kitchen window and thrown a glass at her own reflection because she believed with her whole broken heart that no one wanted her, sat on a cherry bench in the morning light beside the man who had crossed the street that night and never once left, and she understood finally all the way down to the bottom of her that she had been wrong, that Marcus had been wrong, that the whole cruel lesson of 11 years had been wrong, and that the truth was simpler than all of it, and had been standing on her porch with a cup of coffee the entire time. She was wanted. She always had been. She just hadn't known how to let herself be until a quiet man with sawdust on his hands taught her one morning at a time that being wanted wasn't a thing you had to earn or brace against or pay for later. It was just a thing you got to keep. And she kept it. For 30 years, and then 30 more, she kept it on a bench that went slowly, beautifully red.